everybody. I'm Emma Grahn with the National Museum of American History, and I'm joined by my colleague Nissa.
Hi, I'm Nissa Buning, and I'm also from the National Museum of American History and the Lemelson Center.
And we're going to tell you a little bit about some of the work we've been doing in SparkLab since we shut to the public last year in March 2020. So I'm just going to share my screen. Give me just a sec. Can you all see that? Okay, great. So Nissa and I work in SparkLab, which is the hands-on invention space at the National Museum of American History. And we're really geared toward kids 6 to 12, but we work younger and older than that. Anybody who wants to come in and invent is welcome. And it's really a skill development space. It's not really about knowledge acquisition most of the time. For us, being inventive and asking questions is really what it's all about. We want people to get in there and do things, make and tinker, and then share and collaborate. Because we interact with inventions all the time, all day long, every day. We don't always stop and slow down and consider why something is inventive or how we might use something differently. So SparkLab for us is a chance to really do just that. And by looking at things through the lens of invention, we can really inspire our visitors to think like our inventors and to see ordinary things in new ways. And so in normal times, this is a space that's facilitated by a staff of volunteers and facilitators, and they use inquiry to really help prompt close looking, critical thinking, observation, reflection, problem solving, and sort of drawing and sharing their conclusions. And so one of the things we're going to talk about today is how we try to mirror some of that facilitated experience in the virtual environment when we can't be open to the public. Oh, sorry. Here's the room, which as you can see is a really flexible space with lots of tables. And this SparkLab is in the National Museum of American History here in DC, but this is going to tell you a little bit about all of our other SparkLabs.
So we also have a network of SparkLab sites in museums and other organizations across the country. And so I work with those sites and the national network, really thinking about how these invention activities, open-ended challenges can be adapted for different contexts. So in SparkLab, we don't want to just focus on traditional STEM skills. We don't want to focus on engineering or, like Emma said, content acquisition. Our goal is really to open up and show that invention affects our lives in a lot of different ways. And so some of the sites I work with are historic homes, thinking about using their activities to connect to how people lived in the past. I work with science centers, thinking about connecting to the demonstrations that they have about the local automotive industry, or the ways in which people interact with their environments at the Discovery in Reno and the local watershed, and how damming rivers has changed that. So on the next slide, you'll see one of the things that we focus on a lot when we talk about SparkLab is those activities. That's our bread and butter. That's when people come into the room, they see those activities. They're excited to get in there and use their creativity and invent. But today we wanted to take a little bit of a different angle on it. In the pandemic, our space has been closed. Many of the network spaces have been closed or opening in modified ways as well. And this gave us a chance to really shore up the other ways that we talk about invention and learning about the process of invention. And one of those ways is through storytelling. And so we use the platform called the LearningLab. And the LearningLab is primarily a connection to the Smithsonian's digital resources. So users can dive in, they can make their own collections of resources, but they can also rearrange them in different ways. They can add hotspots, they can add quizzes. You can bring in outside resources like PDFs to supplement the connections you're making to the Smithsonian objects. And one of the other great tools you can use that I love is that you can copy and adapt someone else's collection. So you can go in and say, I love this concept, but it's aimed at second graders and I work with eighth graders, and change that a little bit. Or you can say, this is focusing on engineering, and what I'd really like to do is bring in the communication piece, that marketing, sharing your invention aspect rather than the engineering part of it. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Emma to talk a little bit about the ways that we've done this.
So in SparkLab, we have sort of three main tenets, and we're going to talk about each of them today. But the first one is that we believe that everyone is inventive. And there's a couple of really important facets to that. The first is that we invite anybody to come and join us in our space, be it in person at the National Museum of American History, in person at one of our network sites, or in the virtual space that we've created during this really new and challenging, but also exciting time, because it's presented some opportunities to sort of redefine what we mean and who can access this sort of mindset that we're trying to foster in SparkLab. And so part of this is from the user, from the visitor, from the student side. We know that everyone is inventive. Maybe not everybody is going to be an inventor, but everybody has those skills and traits that they need to practice and sort of grow in order to think inventively. But we also feel really, really strongly that representation is important. And in fact, we know this from scholarship. One of my favorite studies from maybe, 10 years ago or so, proved that 9th and 10th graders, I think, scored better on their tests when their textbooks had people that looked like them in the textbook. So I think it was a chemistry class, and when women had women in their chemistry textbook, they scored better on their chemistry tests. So it's not just that we want to inspire everybody to be inventive, but that we know they are, and we want to represent that. So we tell diverse inventor stories. Kids can be inventive. It's really amazing and powerful to see somebody your age who's done something inventive and to be able to tell their stories. Old, young, all races, all backgrounds, that can help inspire students to see themselves in this sort of shared history and shared past, and sort of help them move forward. So for us, without being in the museum, to pair these stories with activities, we have used LearningLab to talk about different kinds of invention stories. So for us, one really exciting project that we've worked on during this time is an exhibit and a poster show that is up at the National Museum of American History right now, and also traveling through the Smithsonian Traveling Exhibition Services poster program. But not everybody is going to be able to go to their library or go to their school to see the poster show. And so we wanted to think about how we could share those stories with more people in new and different ways using LearningLab. And it also gave us an opportunity to expand on those stories and inject different kinds of media. So beyond just the biography of the person, we can click through and look at their patent. We can hear them talking about their own inventiveness in a video clip. We can take a look really closely at their objects that they donated to the museum, their inventions that they created, to sort of flesh out a whole picture of who this person is as both an inventor and a human.
So the second key message we have in SparkLab is that invention is a process. And you can see our process here on this slide. It consists of 7 IT phrases. And these IT phrases come from our study of inventors, both past and present. These were distilled from oral histories, from research, from studying archival documentation that we have in the museum. And through that, our historians developed and prototyped this invention process to reflect the stages that inventors go through when they're creating and marketing their inventions. Now, one of the things that I have to say, and we don't love this graphic, is because it looks very linear, and the invention process isn't linear. We see this a lot when we're working with the activities in SparkLab. It's a drop-in space, someone comes in, and they immediately jump to creating something. They skip right past thinking about what the problem might be, exploring how people have solved this in the past, and sketching their invention. They're just gonna go for it and create something, work on it as they go. And we really want our materials to reflect that unique process that everybody works through individually. You know, sketching may be part of your thinking of your concept. Sketch it may be that you do your patent drawings when you're applying for a patent at the very end of your process. And you'll see here, we have a lot of archival information, primary source documents that we utilize from our archives and our museum collection objects as well within the museum. And so one of the learning labs we have developed that reflects this, on the next slide you'll see, is the story of the shopping cart. So this is one of the stories we love to tell in the American History Museum. As refrigeration was developed, people were able to store more refrigerated objects in their homes rather than a daily trip to the grocery store, the milkman dropping off milk every day. And this invention of refrigeration created its own problem. People were buying more things at the grocery store. They didn't want just a shopping basket. And shopping carts took up so much room. And through this learning lab, you explore the story of Orla Watson developing this telescoping shopping cart, very similar to what we know and still use today, as that development thinking, seeing that problem, recognizing that he could make a change in the way people do things through sketching, through creating and testing and tweaking this into the product that's still used today. And this is such a great way to connect to museum objects, to archives, to those primary source documents, and also have students utilize object-based learning, really close looking at these objects, at these photos, to observe, you know, through the lens of invention, what is a shopping cart? Why would you use the materials that were used? How are people using these inventions? There's a great photo later on in this learning lab. At some point, the baskets tipped up to help you get your groceries out a lot easier. I don't know why we don't have that today. I think that's a great idea. But exploring that process through a historical example of invention is something that happens outside of SparkLab in the rest of our museum. And being able to incorporate that in a really intentional way into our programming during the pandemic has been a really invaluable way to reach out to our audiences.
And then the last core tenet of SparkLab is that invention and innovation have and continue to be an important part of the American experience. And for us, I think sometimes we hear kind of one of two things when we ask people about invention and innovation. They think either oh, that's from the past. Everything that's going to be invented has already been invented. Or we think invention is just this new thing. It's just iPhones and Roombas and the Jetsons. And for us, it's really about a spectrum and a story that helps connect the past to the present and inspire people to think about what inventions come next and what their role in designing for the future can be. And so that exploration and that inspiration that is drawn from the past, drawn from sort of what we have at the museum is really critical. And when we're open in person, this is sort of directly translated into the activities that we create in this space. You can see in the center here is a reinvent the shopping cart activity that for me personally, I think is a really great example of how critical the material culture and how critical the primary sources are in getting people to think through and think critically about a challenge. And it actually really didn't work for me until we could put the pictures of the objects and the primary sources alongside the activity. It was like like the missing piece of the puzzle to help unlock. We also draw from exhibits at our museum. On one side, you'll see America on the Move, which is our exhibit about transportation in the United States, and an activity drawn from that. And we draw from different types of stories. Here you'll see Frances Gable, who is wonderful. Her story is really cool. She invented a self-cleaning house because she was absolutely sick of cleaning. And I think she's a really amazing representation of how anybody can be inventive. But it also it draws on this long story of what we know kids are inventing when you ask them what they want to make, when you ask them what problem they want to solve. They all want to invent a robot that cleans their room. And so this is a really great way to connect the past and the present together. And I also just like her because she looks a lot like my grandma Grahn. So this is sort of a common joke that Nissa and I have, because I think it's something about the glasses. Stephanie Kwolek, who invented Kevlar, had kind of the same glasses at one point. And so there's a fondness that I have for them that way. But because we can't necessarily do that in person right now, we tried to sort of pull that longer storyline, past and present, together using LearningLab as well. So we can look at one problem, how different inventors have solved the same problem in different ways in the past. Here you'll have here you see an example of how people have engaged with toys and having fun and playing through time. Some were great successes, others not so much. You'll see the Edison talking doll, which is a really weird object, if I'm being honest with you. It had a cylinder inside, and as the cylinders wore out, the sound of the voice got very, very scary, and children did not like it. But it's a really amazing invention story about combining different technologies. So there's all these different angles that you can examine when you look really closely at stuff. And in fact, for us, this digital space has been an opportunity to really put some of this history and put some of these objects in the forefront and get people to look really closely at them without the excitement and the magnetism of a hands-on activity in a hands-on space. So we've had a lot of fun developing these resources. This LearningLab platform is super, super, super flexible and adaptive. And you can really do a lot with it, and you can sort of make, as Nissa said, you can make and remix all of these different ingredients to whatever you need in your classroom. So I think, Nissa, did I miss anything major? Maybe we can leave it there. I see we have kind of an active chat, but I would love to answer some questions. I don't know about you. Did I miss anything though?
Nope.
Okay, perfect.
That was it. And for those in the chat, feel free to jump in and add any questions. I also just added the LearningLab links. We were sending them out as we talked about them, and I'm so sorry we were sending them to just the panelists. So they are there in the chat now if you'd like to follow up with any of those. Emma, I think one of the things that I hear a lot as I work with network sites in professional development with teachers and do trainings is how this inventive exploration can be adapted to different subjects. You know, we talk a lot about STEM because that's what we do. We talk a lot about history because we're at a history museum. Do you have any other favorite subjects that you really like to connect this content to?
That's such an unfair question, Nissa, because you know that I don't. I think one of the joys about Invention and one of the joys about SparkLab is that there is an infinite number of connections to any subject matter. And we've had activities that have been highly technical, invent and design a robotic hand, and those connect directly to our robotics collection at the museum. But we also have had activities that are very conceptual that connect to other topics. I'm thinking perhaps of our design a voting poster activity, which is a really amazing and interesting way to think about civics in this different framework. And it's also a really exciting and interesting way to inspire empathy and thinking about who you're inventing for in an environment that you don't always think of, because it's a little bit outside of design thinking. But when you're designing for that activity, you can really think about all sorts of different things. And I'll try to find it if I can. That's online too. But I refuse to answer that question because I will never pick a favorite, because I think the sort of joy of both LearningLab and SparkLab in general is that you can remix things across disciplines, across topics. We sit in a history museum, so we often rely on history, but we're an invention space, so we sort of fall into that STEM lab world too. And it is really, I think, one of the most fun parts of my job. And it looks like there's a question in the chat about whether or not these resources will be available later. They are live and published on LearningLab and searchable, usable for you, and also usable for you to remix now into the future. We have no plans to take them down. Once they are published, they're kind of up on LearningLab, and LearningLab is a huge sort of amazing growing resource. New things are created there every single day. Many of the museums across the Smithsonian are producing all sorts of amazing content there. So it's not just the material that we have, but every day there's something new and exciting on LearningLab. And once it's up, it's kind of up. And that's a great question.
I'll put a plug in for their team as well. They have office hours, they have question and answer sessions, and they have a lot of great programs to connect with teachers and foster that adaptation of the use of LearningLab in your classrooms. So I'm seeing a couple other questions here. Let me go back up. There's one: how do you address the way in which much creativity and invention are combinations of existing things in new ways? And I think that's a question we see in SparkLab a lot. One of the questions I ask our visitors a lot is, as they're inventing, how is this different from what you've seen already? I think when you're creating something, you're exploring the materials, you're exploring the shape, you're thinking about, we had an activity about inventing your own musical instrument. And that was one where we saw a lot of guitars. And so one of my favorite questions was, well, how are you going to make your guitar different from what I can buy at the store already? And even that question prompted so much quick thinking and creativity in, well, mine's smaller because my hands are smaller, or, it's in a different key, things like that, depending on how much of a guitar player they were. But we also look at innovation as a really important of that invention ecosystem. We had Eddie Van Halen's Frankenstein guitar right behind us when we had that activity going, and we were able to go over there and look at how he took parts of different guitars and combined them. At one point, he even put a quarter in to make two pieces meet. They weren't quite even, and he just needed the thickness of a quarter. And so that really sort of basic innovation on existing products.
I think I might add to, I think, especially for students in classrooms, but for our target audience, 6 to 12-year-olds, sometimes the idea may or may not be brand new, but the process of identifying a problem, coming up with their solution, sketching out what they're going to make, building it, iterating it, and then talking to somebody else about it is so important for the way that their mind works and the way that my mind works. That happens to me too. Since I've started working in SparkLab, so many things about the way I look at the world are new and different. And it's, for me, way more about the how they do it than the what they do. So if somebody says, I invented this robot that does my homework for me, I'm going to say, great, tell me about it. How did you come up with that problem? What materials are you going to use? What happens if you do this? And by having conversations and being able to explain their thinking, and even just being able to identify parts and purposes of their invention, they are doing really important, good work that is fostering an inventive mindset, fostering a way of looking at the world, and fostering a really powerful confidence in what they do that they're going to take into the rest of their lives. And so even though the idea may not be new, the process of coming up with the idea is so joyful to watch.
Hi guys, this is Liz, the moderator, jumping in. I just want to tell you that we have about 2 minutes left and we go right into the keynote at 4:40. So we'll have other people joining us from the other rooms at that time.
All right, perfect. That's great to know. So we will start to wrap up. I see Mary asked in the chat about the resources available. They're available to anyone. At some point, they'll ask you to make a free LearningLab account. But other than that creation of an account, it's all free. And I would say if you're interested in hearing more about SparkLab and our process, or more about our activities as well, feel free to contact us. Our emails are down at the bottom of the slide here, and we would love to hear from you and talk more about how these resources can be used.
And then I think we might have time for one more question. There was a really great question, I think, from Lisa about integrating this into a classroom makerspace. And I think one of the things that I might suggest briefly, since we don't have a lot of time, is to take a look at our Do Try This at Home page on our website, invention.si.edu, because that page is full of digital activities that use free 3D drafting software that I think would be really interesting to think about how you might use some of the thinking that exists in those digital activities for an in-person makerspace where you might be able to create something together. So I think I might leave us there, unless Liz or Anne, if there are any other burning questions. Otherwise, I think we might sign off and say goodbye.
Talk about perfect timing. Thanks for a great presentation. I have to say that I wasn't familiar with SparkLab, so now I'm super excited about going and checking it out, and can't wait till all of us can actually visit you in person.
We're looking forward to that too.
So
thanks everyone.
Yeah, thank you for being here. And Liz, thanks so much for hosting us as well.
We are happy to, and we're glad to have learned about you.